So, Simon, let me start with you. The concept for this series, 8 hostage-taking situations. We're going to talk to both the victims and the hostage takers. Sounds like something a producer would come up before a pitch meeting high. And then realize the next day, you know what, that's actually impossible to do. There's no way we're going to get access to one of these stories on both sides, let alone 8 of these stories. How did you manage this, and how did you start with the idea that you could do this and then achieve it?
That's a very good question. I think the process started actually with a kind of period of development where we kind of went out and tried to find stories and get a kind of path to access them. And it actually felt during that process, it did feel kind of impossible. There was a moment where a kind of development producer kind of came and sort of threw their hands up and sort of said, no one wants to talk to us, no one ever will. So God knows why we decided to sort of pursue it. That I guess we got some access. We started to get a bit of access, and that gave us a bit of hope. But no, it was incredibly tough, actually. It was incredibly tough, I guess, to get access to every point of view, every sort of constituent in the negotiation, and particularly the hostage takers themselves, which I guess is why this film is one of my favourites, because it kind of really, you're sort of really immersed in the point of view of the kidnapper, and in the end, you begin, I guess, to understand his perspective and perhaps even sort of empathise in some sense with him as a human being. I think that's what kind of interested you, Doug, wasn't it?
Yeah, when Simon brought this to me and talked about seeing the kidnapper's point of view, that's what hooked me. And my first question was, will they really talk to us? And where do we find them? And how dangerous will that be to go to where they are and film them? But probably because I'm very attracted to anti-heroes, and in a way I felt like I was going to root more in a way for the people, the hostage takers, than the hostages, and that that was going to be a point of view that was going to be very important for me. And if you look at my films, it's sort of hard to tell who the villain is and who the hero is. I mean, even Fair Game, where someone's taking on George W. Bush, who the person taking on George W. Bush may be an even darker character than George W. Bush. And so I really was drawn to this idea, and the reality is, I really do connect to Ronaldo and can see the world from his point of view and feel the income inequality and the feeling that you deserve something and you're going to go for it.
Maybe, Simon, you could give us a little overview of what some of these other episodes are.
Yeah, sure. I mean, we sort of try to sort of look at as many different kinds of hostage situations as we could across the series, and indeed travel the globe. So we have a film about the Somalian pirate hostage crisis, where they took a couple of British retired holiday makers. We have a couple of American missionaries who were taken by an Al-Qaeda linked group in the Philippines. We have a kind of a Chechen story with kind of very particularly brutal, happy ending in the sense that the hostages were released, but they had an absolutely awful time in that episode. I don't know why I'm laughing. I shouldn't be laughing. Do they all have happy endings? I mean, most of them have sort of somewhat happy endings. In many of the hostages in our series survive, but some of them don't. And there's one story in particular, I guess, where these American missionaries where we it was a married couple that got taken hostage in the Philippines, and she survives and her husband tragically doesn't. So it's a very sort of bittersweet ending. And I think a lot of the stories sort of have that bittersweetness about them.
We obviously needed somebody to survive to interview today.
So in the case of this situation where the hostage takers were expecting more money and weren't getting it, can you illuminate that?
Well, I mean, there's something I think that's kind of common that you'll find a lot of. I mean, we were very interested in the kind of the kind of dynamics of the negotiation. We kind of felt that the hostage experience is something that's kind of well sort of trodden in literature and film, but the kind of the actual transactional kind of nature of a hostage situation, the business of it, is less explored. And I think a common theme in these films is that you don't actually get what you want as a negotiator by giving the person who wants the thing that they're asking for what they're asking for. You have to negotiate, and you know, I don't think this family had endless resources by any means, but I think there was a kind of process of negotiation that sort of had to take place as a kind of dance that maybe a game that I think the hostage takers are just as engaged in as the representatives of the hostages.
How did you pick the case, and did you have the voice of the kidnappers in every episode?
I mean, Simon had a really amazing team put together and called through many more cases than actually ended up on screen. And no, we didn't always get access to the kidnapper, but we always got multiple points of view. But some of these situations involve many different factions. A lot of times there were military heavily involved in rescue attempts that are documented, and so some of the points of view aren't necessarily the kidnapper, but there can be opposing points of view between people who maybe want to pay the ransom and people who think the ransom shouldn't be paid and a military style attack should take place. So there are always different points of view.
Doug, I think people are well aware of your fiction directing credits. I wonder, had you worked in documentary before, and how was this experience working on these stories different than working on fiction projects?
Well, my fiction projects usually draw pretty heavily from reality. There's a lot of the same kind of research that went into the series that go into my fictional movies, and something like Born Identity draws heavily from Iran-Contra. In fact, people in the film are playing real-life characters from that, and so part of why I make fairly Hollywood-type movies, but I live in New York, and the main reason I do that is so that I'm closer to sort of what I consider the real world. I don't live in this kind of vacuum, and so the kinds of, if I wasn't making something like this show, I'd be watching it.
If any of us are ever taken hostage or have a close family member taken hostage, what have you learned from this series?
Well, one thing I have learned, I think is quite interesting. I think it's kind of one of the reasons why I wanted to do is don't rely on your governments to sort of to rescue you. It's kind of one of the sort of central kind of paradoxes of I think hostage situations is that.
Especially if you're an American.
Yeah, especially if you're an American. If you're an Italian, or French person, you might be a bit better off. But
that's not to be disparaging. It is the,
no,
the
absolutely.
policy of
It
our
is the
government
policy
to
of
not help at all.
Absolutely. And I think it's in a way it kind of represents for me that kind of paradox is kind of emotionally unsustainable. Basically, in the end, governments do end up developing back channels and supporting ransom payments because faced with the families of people who are likely to die if they don't, there's very little other option. I think that's kind of sort of fascinating, that area.
So you're the first audience to see Captive. Simon, can you remind us when it comes to Netflix?
Yeah, I think the technical term is it drops on December the 9th. Actually, Jason said that I shouldn't say that. It launches, which is kind of more.
So please spread the word. There's 6 more days ahead of documentaries at DOCNYC. I hope you get to come back. Thanks very much for coming. Thanks especially to Doug Liman and Simon Chinn.